Everyone's talking about Disney's upcoming Lion King reboot like it's some kind of revolutionary moment. Finally, they say, Disney's going to fix the problems with the original. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. This reboot won't fix anything. In fact, it's going to make everything worse. Look, I get it. The marketing machine is in full swing, promising us a deeper, more nuanced take on the classic story. They're throwing around words like reimagined and elevated storytelling. But let's be honest about what's really happening here. Disney isn't fixing problems. They're slapping expensive band-aids on a story they're too scared to actually examine. Think about what Disney considers the problems with the 1994 original. According to their press releases and interviews, the issues are things like outdated animation techniques and opportunities for expanded character development. Notice what's missing from that list. Any acknowledgement of the actual storytelling problems that have been staring us in the face for 30 years. The marketing tells us we're getting a more realistic portrayal of the animal kingdom, more authentic African cultural elements, enhanced musical numbers with contemporary relevance. But here's what they're not telling you. None of these surface-level changes address the fundamental issues that make The Lion King a problematic story in the first place. You want to know what Disney's idea of fixing looks like? It's making Scar's Scar more photorealistic. It's adding 10 more minutes of Timon and Pumbaa comedy. It's hiring A-list voice actors and calling it elevated. It's expanding the soundtrack with songs that sound exactly like the originals but with slightly different lyrics. This isn't innovation, it's expensive karaoke. The real kicker? They're using the exact same story structure, the same character arcs, the same resolution that made the original feel hollow for anyone who thought about it for more than 5 minutes. They're just wrapping it in prettier CGI and calling it progress. But what really gets me is how the studio talks about this project like they're doing us a favor. Like they've identified these deep flaws in the original, and now, out of the goodness of their corporate hearts, they're going to deliver the Lion King we deserve. The audacity is breathtaking. Here's a wild thought. What if the problems with the Lion King aren't technical? What if they're not about animation quality or voice acting or even musical arrangements? What if the problems are baked into the very foundation of the story itself? Because when you strip away the nostalgia and the beautiful animation and that incredible Hans Zimmer score, you're left with a narrative that doesn't actually make sense when you examine it closely. A story about monarchy that pretends to have depth, but refuses to engage with any of the complex questions that monarchy raises. A tale about the circle of life that uses that concept as a convenient excuse to avoid dealing with actually difficult moral questions. Disney knows this, by the way. They have to know. You don't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a project without somebody in those boardrooms pointing out the plot holes and character motivation issues and thematic contradictions. But acknowledging those problems would require actually fixing them. And fixing them would mean creating something genuinely different. Something that might not test well with focus groups. Something that might not guarantee the same nostalgic emotional response that drives people to theaters. So instead, we get the illusion of progress. We get improvements that are really just distractions. Shinier graphics to keep you from noticing that the story still doesn't hold water. Better voice acting to mask the fact that these characters still don't have coherent motivations. Enhanced musical numbers to drown out the sound of logical inconsistencies. And the worst part? It's working. People are genuinely excited about this reboot because Disney has convinced them that the problems with The Lion King were always about production values rather than storytelling fundamentals. They've successfully redirected the conversation away from, does this story actually make sense? To, wow, look how realistic that lion looks. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because while Disney is busy polishing the surface of this story, they're actually making the deeper problems more obvious than ever before. Let's talk about what Disney actually refuses to acknowledge about The Lion King. Because while they're busy perfecting the CGI whiskers and hiring Broadway stars, there are fundamental storytelling problems that have been festering in this narrative for decades. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the lion in the Pride Rock. The entire premise of The Lion King falls apart the moment you ask basic questions about how this society actually functions. We're told this is a story about the natural order, but nothing about the power structure in the Pride Lands reflects anything resembling natural lion behavior. In real lion prides, females do the hunting. Males typically don't lead in the way Mufasa does. The whole concept of a hereditary monarchy passing from father to son is completely artificial when applied to actual lion social structures. But Disney needs that monarchy structure because the entire story depends on it. Without the concept of rightful inheritance, Scar's coup becomes just one lion replacing another, and Simba's return becomes, what exactly? A hostile takeover? Here's where it gets really uncomfortable. The Lion King is essentially a story about maintaining existing power structures at all costs. Think about it. Scar's reign is portrayed as objectively evil, but what exactly makes it evil? The drought? That's environmental, not political. The hyenas having access to food? Well, why shouldn't they? They're a part of the ecosystem too, aren't they? The story wants us to believe that Scar's rule is wrong, because it goes against the natural order. But it never actually explains what makes Mufasa's rule more legitimate beyond his father was king before him. That's not natural order, that's just hereditary privilege with a nature documentary aesthetic. And speaking of Scar, let's talk about Disney's attempts to give him more depth in recent years. They've tried to explain his villainy through backstory. The Lion Guard series suggested he was corrupted by a cobra's bite. Various books have given him tragic origins. But here's the thing. Adding tragic backstory doesn't fix a fundamentally broken character. Scar's problem isn't that he lacks motivation. His problem is that his motivations actually make more sense than the hero's motivations, but the story treats them as obviously evil. He wants to change a system that excludes an entire species from resources they need to survive. He questions why one family should rule over everyone else forever. These aren't the thoughts of a monster. They're the thoughts of someone asking reasonable questions about an unreasonable system. But Disney can't acknowledge this because it would mean acknowledging that their hero story is actually about preserving an unjust status quo. So instead, they double down on making Scar more obviously villainous through supernatural corruption or psychological trauma. They'll give him more screen time, better dialogue, more complex emotions, but they'll never address the fact that his basic critique of Pride Rock's power structure is completely valid. This brings us to the circle of life, Disney's magical solution to any inconvenient moral questions. Whenever the story encounters a problem it can't solve, it just invokes the circle of life as if that explains everything. Why do lions get to eat other animals? Circle of life. Why do some animals get to live in the good part of the savannah while others are stuck in the wasteland? Circle of life. Why is hereditary monarchy the ideal form of government? Circle of life, obviously. It's brilliant, really, as a conversation stopper. You can't argue with the circle of life because it's presented as a fundamental natural law rather than a political philosophy. But that's exactly what it is. A political philosophy disguised as natural law. It's a way of saying things are the way they are because that's how they're supposed to be, without having to justify why they're supposed to be that way. The circle of life allows the story to present a deeply hierarchical, exclusionary society as natural and good while avoiding any discussion of whether that society actually serves the needs of everyone who lives in it. It's conservative political philosophy wrapped in nature documentary footage. And here's what's really insidious about this. The story actively punishes characters who question this system. Scar's downfall isn't presented as the result of poor leadership or moral failings. It's presented as the inevitable consequence of disrupting the natural order. The message is clear. Don't ask questions about why things are the way they are, because questioning the system leads to chaos and suffering. But the most frustrating part? Disney knows all of this. They have to know. You don't create multiple sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and now a full reboot without somebody in those story meetings pointing out these massive logical and ethical holes. The fact that they keep avoiding these issues isn't ignorance, it's a deliberate choice. They could explore what happens when Simba actually tries to rule fairly. They could examine whether the exile of the hyenas was just, or whether integration might have been possible. They could question whether hereditary monarchy is really the best system for a diverse ecosystem. They could ask whether the circle of life philosophy actually serves everyone equally, but they won't. Because asking those questions would require creating a story that doesn't automatically validate existing power structures. It would mean writing characters who have to grapple with complex moral choices instead of just following predetermined roles. It would mean creating a narrative that treats political systems as things that can and should be examined and potentially changed, rather than natural laws that must be preserved. And you know what the really maddening part is? This avoidance of complexity isn't even good business anymore. Audiences are hungry for stories that engage with difficult questions. Look at the success of shows like Avatar, The Last Airbender, which manages to tell a story about power and responsibility without resorting to "because that's how things are" as an explanation. But Disney's approach to the Lion King reboot suggests they'd rather spend hundreds of millions of dollars on technical improvements than risk the kind of creative examination that might actually justify remaking this story in the first place. And honestly, it gets worse from here. Because not only is Disney avoiding the fundamental problems with the original story, they're actively making those problems more obvious and more damaging through their approach to these remakes. Here's where Disney's approach goes from misguided to actively destructive. Because it's not enough that they're avoiding the real problems with The Lion King, they're creating entirely new problems that make the story even less coherent than it was before. Let's start with the most obvious issue: the shift from traditional animation to photorealistic CGI. Disney's marketing department wants you to believe this is an upgrade, a more mature and sophisticated way to tell the story. But what they've actually done is strip away the very thing that made the original Lion King work as well as it did: the emotional expressiveness that only animation can provide. Think about the most powerful moments in the 1994 film. Mufasa's expression when he sees Simba in danger during the wildebeest stampede. Scar's subtle facial changes when he's manipulating other characters. Simba's wide-eyed wonder during "I just can't wait to be king." These moments work because animated faces can convey emotions in ways that real animal faces simply cannot. But Disney's new approach demands photorealistic animal faces, which means sacrificing emotional expression for visual authenticity. The result? Characters who look incredibly lifelike but feel completely dead inside. You're watching beautiful nature documentary footage with voiceover work, not characters experiencing genuine emotions. This isn't just an aesthetic choice, it's a storytelling disaster. The Lion King is a story that depends entirely on us connecting emotionally with these characters. When Mufasa falls, we need to feel Simba's anguish. When Scar schemes, we need to see the calculation in his eyes. When Simba finally embraces his destiny, we need to witness that transformation in his expression. None of that works when your characters look like they stepped out of planet Earth. You can hire the best voice actors in the world, but if their characters' faces can't match the emotion in their voices, you've broken the fundamental connection between audience and story. But it gets worse. Because Disney isn't just making this technical mistake in isolation. They're doubling down on it across their entire approach to the Lion King franchise, the Lion Guard series, the various direct-to-video sequels, and now this reboot are all part of Disney's strategy to create an expanded universe around the Lion King. And every new addition makes the original story more confusing and contradictory. Take the Lion Guard as an example. This series attempts to explain Scar's backstory, introduces new magical elements to the Lion King world, and creates an entire mythology around the roar of the elders. Sounds like world building, right? Except it directly contradicts the tone and logic of the original film. The original Lion King worked partly because it kept its magical elements subtle and mysterious. The great kings of the past appearing in the stars? Beautiful and mythic. Rafiki's mystical knowledge? Intriguing, but never fully explained. The film understood that some things are more powerful when they remain mysterious. But the Lion Guard turns all of this into a Pokemon-style power system, with rules and hierarchies and ancient prophecies. Suddenly, the subtle spirituality of the original becomes a full-blown fantasy adventure, complete with magical artifacts and special abilities. It's not expanding the world, it's fundamentally changing what kind of world it is. And now we're getting a Mufasa prequel that promises to explain his origins and his relationship with Scar. But here's the thing, we didn't need Mufasa's origin story. The power of Mufasa as a character came from his mythic quality, his larger-than-life presence that suggested a depth we could imagine but never fully know. He was effective precisely because he felt like a legend. not a regular person we happened to meet when he was young. Explaining Mufasa's backstory is like explaining how magic tricks work. It doesn't enhance the experience, it destroys it. We're going to watch young Mufasa learn life lessons and make mistakes, and gradually become the wise king we remember. And every moment of that journey is going to make the character smaller and more mundane. This is Disney's fundamental misunderstanding of what makes characters compelling. They seem to believe that more information always equals more engagement, that audiences always want deeper lore and extended mythology. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave space for the audience's imagination to fill in the gaps. The original Lion King benefited enormously from what it didn't show us. We didn't see Mufasa's childhood, so we could imagine him as someone who had always been wise and noble. We didn't get a detailed explanation of how the Pride Land's political system worked, so we could focus on the emotional journey without getting bogged down in logistics. We didn't see exactly how Scar spent his time plotting, so he remained mysterious and threatening. But the expanded universe approach demands that every mystery be solved, every backstory be revealed, every corner of the world be mapped and explained. The result is a fictional universe that feels smaller and more mechanical with each new addition. This connects to a larger problem with Disney's current approach to storytelling. They've confused complexity with depth. They think that adding more characters, more plot lines, more magical systems, and more backstory automatically makes their stories more sophisticated. But complexity without purpose is just clutter. The Lion King didn't need to be more complex. It needed to be more honest about the complexity it already contained. Instead of adding new magical elements, they could have explored the existing political and social dynamics more thoroughly. Instead of explaining Mufasa's past, they could have examined his present-day decisions more critically. Instead of expanding the cast of characters, they could have given the existing characters more nuanced motivations. But that kind of depth requires taking creative risks, and Disney's current business model is built around minimizing creative risks. It's much safer to add more content than to examine existing content more critically. It's easier to create new characters than to make existing characters more complex. It's more marketable to promise more Lion King than to promise better Lion King. And here's the really insidious part. Each new addition to the Lion King universe makes it harder to fix the original problems because now you have to maintain continuity across multiple stories that were never designed to work together. You can't fundamentally reimagine Scar's character because you've already established his backstory in The Lion Guard. You can't explore alternative political systems because you've already shown how the monarchy continues in The Lion King 2. The expanded universe has become a creative prison, locking the franchise into a version of itself that prioritizes consistency over quality, familiarity over innovation, and marketing synergy over storytelling coherence. But here's what's really frustrating. None of this was inevitable. Disney could have approached the Lion King reboot as an opportunity to distill the story down to its essential elements and rebuild from there. They could have used the technical capabilities of modern filmmaking to enhance the emotional core of the story rather than replace it with empty spectacle. Instead, they've chosen the path that leads to the most merchandising opportunities and the least creative risk. And that choice reveals something important about what's really driving these decisions. Let's stop pretending this is about storytelling and start talking about what this is really about. Money. Because every single creative decision Disney is making with the Lion King reboot becomes crystal clear when you understand the business model driving these choices. Disney isn't trying to fix the Lion King because they think it needs fixing. They're remaking the Lion King because they've figured out how to monetize nostalgia more efficiently than any studio in history. And the improvements they're promising, those aren't artistic choices. They're market research data points translated into product features. Think about it. Disney spent 4 years and untold millions of dollars on market research before greenlighting this reboot. They didn't survey audiences about what themes should be explored or what character development opportunities were missed in the original. They asked questions like, what elements of The Lion King do you remember most fondly? And which characters would you be most excited to see again? And how important is visual realism to your movie-going experience? The answers to those questions shaped every major decision about this reboot. Photorealistic animation. Test audiences responded positively to cutting-edge technology and realistic visuals. Expanded roles for Timon and Pumbaa. Focus groups identified them as the most quotable and merchandisable characters. More songs? Market research showed that musical elements drove the highest emotional engagement scores. But here's what Disney didn't ask. Do you think The Lion King's political themes hold up to modern scrutiny? Or would you be interested in a version that examined the moral complexity of monarchy? Or should we explore the ethical implications of the hyena's treatment? Because those questions might lead to answers that would require actual creative risk-taking. Disney's business model depends on delivering the experience that focus groups say they want, not the experience that might challenge or surprise them. And what focus groups consistently say they want is the thing I remember but better, not different, not more complex, not more challenging, just shinier. This is why we're getting a Lion King that looks dramatically different, but tells exactly the same story in exactly the same way. Disney has identified the specific nostalgic triggers that drive people to theaters, and they're building the entire reboot around maximizing those triggers while minimizing anything that might interfere with the nostalgia delivery system. Consider the casting choices. They're not hiring voice actors based on who would bring the most interesting interpretation to these characters. They're hiring them based on who will generate the most social media buzz and appeal to the broadest possible demographic. James Earl Jones returning as Mufasa isn't a creative decision. It's a marketing strategy designed to provide a direct emotional link to the original film. The same logic applies to the musical elements. They're not reimagining the songs because they think the originals need improvement. They're keeping them almost identical because market research has identified those melodies as primary nostalgia triggers. But they're adding just enough new material to justify selling a new soundtrack album and creating new marketing moments. Even the decision to make this a live-action remake instead of a traditional animated sequel comes down to business considerations. Live-action remakes of animated classics have proven to be incredibly lucrative for Disney. They can market them as both nostalgic experiences for adults and cutting-edge entertainment for younger audiences. It's the perfect product for maximizing both demographic reach and ticket prices. But here's where it gets really cynical. Disney isn't just trying to make one successful movie. They're trying to establish a foundation for decades of Lion King content. This reboot isn't an end goal. It's the starting point for a franchise expansion that will include more sequels, more prequels, more spin-offs, more streaming series, more theme park attractions, and more merchandise lines. Every creative decision is being filtered through the question, how does this support long-term franchise viability, rather than how does this serve the story? That's why we're getting expanded world building instead of deeper character development. That's why we're getting more characters instead of more complex characters. That's why we're getting visual spectacle instead of emotional sophistication. The business model requires content that can be endlessly extended and modified without losing its essential marketable qualities. You can't build a sustainable franchise around a story that reaches a satisfying conclusion. You need a story that leaves room for infinite expansion. You can't build a merchandise empire around complex moral questions. You need simple, iconic characters that translate well to plush toys and Happy Meal promotions. This explains why Disney keeps adding magical elements to the Lion King universe. Magic systems create opportunities for new characters with new powers, which create opportunities for new storylines, which create opportunities for new products. The Roar of the Elders isn't a storytelling device, it's a product development tool. It also explains why they're so resistant to actually examining the political themes in the original story. Political complexity is bad for business because it makes the content harder to market internationally and creates potential controversy that could impact merchandise sales. It's much safer to stick with good versus evil narratives that don't require audiences to think too hard about whose side they should be on. The most telling example of this business-first approach? The way Disney talks about fixing The Lion King while simultaneously greenlighting projects that extend and canonize the exact same story structure they're supposedly improving. They're making a Mufasa prequel that will inevitably reinforce the same monarchical themes. They're continuing The Lion Guard, which doubles down on the magical destiny narrative. They're developing new theme park experiences based on the existing character dynamics. If they really believed the original story had fundamental problems, they wouldn't be building an entire entertainment empire around perpetuating those same problems. The fact that they are reveals that the fixes in the reboot are just surface-level changes designed to justify repackaging the same product for a new generation. And here's the really frustrating part. This approach is incredibly effective from a business perspective. The 2019 Lion King remake, despite being widely criticized for its soulless execution and technical missteps, made over $1.6 billion worldwide. That success validated Disney's entire approach and guaranteed that they would continue making the same types of creative decisions. The audience has essentially told Disney through their ticket purchases that they preferred nostalgic familiarity over creative innovation. And Disney has responded by building a business model that delivers exactly that, regardless of the artistic cost. But what makes this particularly insidious is how Disney packages these business decisions as artistic choices. They don't say, "We're remaking The Lion King because our market research indicates strong franchise potential." They say, "We're honored to introduce these beloved characters to a new generation." They don't admit, "We're avoiding political complexity because it's bad for international sales." They claim, "We're focusing on the timeless themes that make this story universal." It's marketing language designed to make commerce sound like art, to make focus group data sound like creative inspiration, to make franchise building sound like storytelling vision. And the result? They're not fixing The Lion King, they're commodifying it. They're turning a story into a product line, characters into brand ambassadors, and themes into talking points. They're creating the illusion of improvement while actually making the fundamental problems worse. Because now those problems are locked into a business model that depends on perpetuating them forever. But here's what's really tragic about all of this. There's actually a better way to approach this story, creatively and commercially. Because the biggest missed opportunity isn't just artistic, it's financial. So what would a genuinely improved Lion King actually look like? Not the surface-level polish Disney is offering, but a version that actually grapples with the story's fundamental contradictions and emerges stronger on the other side? First, let's be clear about what we're really talking about here. A true Lion King remake wouldn't just change how the story looks, it would change how the story thinks. It would take the basic premise of a young prince learning to accept responsibility and actually examine what responsibility means in a complex society. Imagine a Lion King that starts with the same setup but asks different questions. What if Simba's exile forced him to see the Pride Lands from the perspective of the animals who don't benefit from the current system? What if his time with Timon and Pumbaa wasn't just comic relief, but a genuine exploration of alternative ways to organize society? Picture Simba discovering communities where leadership isn't inherited but earned, where resources are shared rather than hoarded, where different species cooperate as equals rather than existing in rigid hierarchies. Suddenly, his return to the Pride Lands becomes not just a restoration of the old order, but a chance to build something better. This version would force us to confront uncomfortable questions about power and privilege that the original story carefully avoids. It would acknowledge that Simba's birthright doesn't automatically make him a good leader, that the natural order might not be as natural or orderly as it appears, that maybe the hyenas have legitimate grievances that can't be dismissed with appeals to tradition. But here's what's really exciting about this approach. It wouldn't require abandoning what works about the original story. The emotional core, a young person learning to face their responsibilities and overcome their fears, remains intact. The spectacular setting, the memorable characters, the powerful themes about growth and courage and family, all of that stays. What changes is the depth and honesty of the examination. Instead of Simba simply accepting that he must restore his father's kingdom exactly as it was, he has to grapple with whether that kingdom was just in the first place. Instead of Scar being evil because he disrupts the natural order, his motivations become genuinely complex. He's wrong about the methods, but maybe not wrong about the problems he's trying to solve. This kind of storytelling would actually be more compelling, not less. Audiences are hungry for stories that treat them like intelligent adults capable of handling moral complexity. Look at the success of shows like Avatar, The Last Airbender, which manages to be both accessible to children and sophisticated enough to satisfy adults who want their entertainment to engage with serious themes. A genuinely reimagined Lion King could explore questions about environmental stewardship that go beyond simple humans bad, nature good messaging. It could examine different cultural approaches to leadership and governance. It could investigate what happens when traditional wisdom conflicts with contemporary needs. It could ask whether the circle of life philosophy actually serves everyone equally, or whether it's just a convenient way to avoid addressing inequality. And here's the thing. This approach would actually be better business, not worse, because stories that engage with complexity and respect their audience's intelligence tend to have longer cultural lifespans than stories that rely purely on nostalgia and spectacle. They generate genuine discussion, create lasting emotional connections, and inspire the kind of passionate fan base that sustains franchises for decades. Think about the difference between something like Star Wars, which has maintained cultural relevance for nearly 50 years by continuously evolving and exploring new themes, versus something like Transformers, which relies primarily on spectacle and nostalgia and has to reboot itself every few years to maintain audience interest. Disney could position themselves as the studio that takes beloved stories seriously enough to examine them critically, that trusts audiences to engage with complex themes, that uses cutting-edge technology in service of sophisticated storytelling, rather than as a replacement for it. That would be genuinely innovative in a way that photorealistic animal fur simply isn't. But let's be honest about why this won't happen. Because the kind of examination I'm describing would require Disney to acknowledge that some of their most beloved properties contain ideas that don't hold up to scrutiny. It would mean admitting that nostalgia isn't always a reliable guide to quality, that popularity doesn't guarantee wisdom, that sometimes the things we loved as children need to be fundamentally reconsidered as adults. And that's scary, both creatively and commercially. It's much easier to blame technical limitations or outdated animation techniques than to confront the possibility that the story itself might need serious revision. It's safer to promise the Lion King you remember, but better, than to deliver the Lion King you need but different. This connects to a larger problem in contemporary entertainment culture. We've become so focused on preservation and restoration that we've forgotten about transformation and growth. We want our childhood favorites to be validated and celebrated, not examined and evolved. We want the comfort of familiarity, not the challenge of genuine improvement. But here's what we're losing in that trade-off. We're losing the opportunity to discover what these stories might become if we allowed them to grow and change. We're losing the chance to use them as vehicles for exploring contemporary questions and challenges. We're losing the possibility that they might surprise us, challenge us, or teach us something new. Most importantly, we're losing the connection between entertainment and genuine cultural discourse. When stories become products to be consumed rather than ideas to be engaged with, they stop serving their most important function, helping us understand ourselves and our world more deeply. The Lion King reboot represents everything wrong with this approach. It takes a story with genuine potential for growth and locks it into a form that prioritizes comfort over challenge, familiarity over insight, marketing appeal over artistic integrity. But it doesn't have to be this way. Audiences are capable of handling complexity. Children are capable of understanding nuance. Stories are capable of being both entertaining and intellectually honest. The only thing stopping us from getting the Lion King we actually need is the assumption that we don't want it. So here's my challenge to you. Stop settling for surface-level improvements to stories that deserve better. Stop accepting the argument that commercial success justifies creative cowardice. Stop pretending that nostalgia is the same thing as quality. Demand better, not just from Disney, but from the entire entertainment industry. Demand stories that trust your intelligence, that engage with difficult questions, that use their platform to explore rather than just to comfort. Because ultimately, that's what real storytelling is about. Not confirming what we already believe, but challenging us to think more deeply about what we believe and why. The Lion King could be that kind of story, if we insisted on it being that kind of story. The question is, are we brave enough to let go of the version we remember in order to discover the version we actually need? That's the conversation Disney is desperately trying to avoid having. But maybe it's time we had it anyway.